Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to a special edition of Banjo Strings and Drinking Gourds. My name is Mark Mizaki, and I am an interpreter here at the Frontier Culture Museum. Before I started working here at the Frontier Culture Museum, I've spent about the last 15 years or so working at various museums, principally at the Jamestown settlement where I worked on the ships. And one of the things I talked about was the arrival of the first Africans here to Virginia. And so that's what we're going to talk about today is talking about the arrival of the first Africans here into the colony of Virginia and the creation of an American culture highlighted by the merging of different groups such as the Igbo from modern-day Nigeria, the English, the Scots-Irish, and the Germans, all settling here in the colony of Virginia. We do this at the beginning of Black History Month and continue an American tradition of commemorating the achievements of African Americans and highlighting their legacies and contributions to the tapestry that is the history of the United States. Black History Month was started in 1976 and was the nation's way of unifying a number of different African American celebrations and educational programs that dotted the nation. Some of these initiatives were over 50 years old at the time, and bringing them under the national umbrella allowed their message to spread not just here in the United States, but to other nations around the world. February was chosen for these early initiatives because both Abraham Lincoln and Frederick Douglass were both born in February, and it's a continuation of the work that dominated their lives, talking about the influences of African American society here in the United States. So let's begin with the arrival of the first Africans. The story begins a little bit before the arrival of the first Africans here in Virginia in 1619. It all kind of starts with the fall of the city of Constantinople back in 1453 and the ending of the Byzantine Empire. The Ottoman Turks now had pretty much a monopoly on all the trade goods along the Silk Road coming into Europe. Nations such as Spain, Portugal, France, and England now found those goods coming from the Orient far more expensive. And wishing both for cheaper goods and for gaining the wealth of trade coming in from China, they began the Age of Exploration. The Portuguese were the first to put significant amounts of effort into sailing around the tip of Africa, trying to get to the Indian Ocean. To aid in these endeavors, the Portuguese set up resupply bases all along the coast of Africa, including West Africa. The goods that were available to the ships were for reprovisions, wood, rope, and food. They also then had access to trade goods coming out of West Africa, such as gold, ivory, Kuba cloth, slaves, which were part of an existing internal slave trade. And later on, New World imports such as tobacco. With Columbus's discovery of the New World in 1492 and Spain's growing colonial empire and its conquest of the indigenous people, the Indian population were put to work in gold and silver mines, as well as working on plantations of sugar and tobacco. The backbreaking labor and the European diseases decimated the Indian population. The Spanish turned to their Portuguese neighbors and its access to the West African slave markets to replace the declining Indian population. This process grows and develops into chattel race-based slavery that dominates the 18th century. So in 1619, transatlantic slave trade is more than 100 years old. African princes along the coast are raiding into the interior of the continent, capturing people, bringing them to the coast, and selling them into slavery here in the New World. They're doing so to buy European goods, such as cloth, linen, and wool, guns, and gunpowder. And the Europeans are buying slaves. Now, the slave ship that's going to be part of our story is from West Africa. It's a Portuguese ship, and it's on its way to Mexico to sell slaves. If you ever want to get a good sense on how little the people of the time period really understood the moral problems with slavery, the name of the slave ship was the St. John the Baptist. That's like naming your slave ship the Freedom or the Liberty. So these folks are being put on board the Portuguese ship and set sail. And while they're going across the Atlantic Ocean, they are attacked by pirates. Well, technically privateers. Basically, privateers are pirates who work for a government, in this case, English ships working for the government of the Dutch. And they are the Lion and the Treasure. They capture the St. John the Baptist, they board the ship, and they want to get down into the cargo hold to find gold, silver, and other precious gems. And there are all these slaves in the cargo areas. So to make space, they start taking the slaves off of the ship and putting them onto their own vessels to make room. In the middle of this process, the Portuguese and Spanish sailors escape, retake their ship, and get away. We know this part of the story because when they make it to Mexico, they report the pirate attack. The rest of the story we pick up from English sources. These ships now with, as they reported, 20 and odd Africans, extra mouths to feed, and not really any supplies, went to the nearest friendly harbor that they had, which ends up being Jamestown, Virginia. They arrive in Virginia, and we don't know exactly how the details are worked out, but what seems to happen is they drop off these now freed Africans into the colony of Virginia in exchange for food and other supplies, and then they turn around and head back to the Caribbean. Now, for the English at this period, slavery was against the law. So what's likely happening is these Africans are being indentured, probably for the cost of the provisions. A typical indenture contract for people working in the Virginia Company was about 7 years. We don't know what happens to all of these folks who are brought over. We do know that some of them are going to work in Virginia for a number of years and then will be paid out in land, like most of the other English colonists. But these African workers, they have a couple of advantages. One, tobacco had been introduced into Africa almost a century before, and so many of these folks already knew how to grow the cash crop of Virginia. Secondly, Africa is a tropical climate, at least where these folks were from in Angola, and they're not dying from the summer heat here in Virginia. So the Virginia Company wants more African indentures and employees. And there are none in England, obviously. So they go to Africa, and nobody in Africa is really all that interested in working for the English. So they go to slave markets, buy slaves, and because slavery was against the law, they freed the slaves and indentured them in the same breath, adding years to service onto their contracts. So what was a 7-year contract will turn into 14-year contracts. And then you'll start seeing 30-year contracts, and then 50-year contracts. Eventually, you'll end up seeing contracts that have you indentured for life. That brings us to about the 1650s. In the 1660s, the first slave laws are passed here on the books in Virginia. The important part is, if you are indentured for life, you became a slave. And if your mother was a slave, you too were now a slave, creating a perpetual and never-ending institution of slavery. If you give it a generation or so, and the only slaves that the English typically have access to being black African slaves, being black and being a slave starts becoming the same thing. Give it another few generations, and we're now at the time of the Founding Fathers, they'll even codify it by saying that a slave is 3/5 of a person. Give it a few more generations, and the eve of the Civil War, it's not even that anymore. Civil War ends the institution of slavery, but the racism that it created is going to linger long past, and it's one of those legacies that we are still dealing with here in the United States today. I want to thank you all for listening to me talk for a few moments about the development of slavery here in Virginia.